All right, so welcome to everybody. We're starting in Daniel chapter 8, page 1315 in the Concordia Bible. And I want to just review, keep in mind what we learned in the last chapter, because chapter 7 is so significant. It gave us this a view from heaven, so to speak. We saw God on his throne. Well, we saw with Daniel 4 beasts coming out of the sea that represent world kingdoms. And then we saw God on his throne, and then this human being person, this one like a son of man, Daniel says, who comes with the clouds of heaven and approaches the Ancient of Days, and he is given all authority and power in heaven and on earth. And so he, the one like a son of man, is God's, basically God's king, that he is saying, I'm going to rule and govern my kingdom on earth through this king, and he is the one. So we know that of course is a vision of Jesus the Messiah, and in chapter 9 we're going to see more about what that means. We also saw in chapter 7 a review for you, because this is important for chapter 8, in that there was an enemy that was revealed in the vision, a little horn that came up from among the 10 horns on the 4th beast, and this little horn displaced 3 other horns and so on. But this little horn was shows to be an enemy of God, because he's speaking great and lordly words, blasphemous words against God. And he is revealed in verse 21 and 25 that he is making war against God's people, the saints. And in verse 25 it gives the details. He will speak against God, he will wear out the saints, and they will be given into his hand, into his power, for a time, times, and half a time. And so we would say, why would God allow his people to be handed over to the enemy, for the enemy to do his worst? And that's a very disturbing vision. And that's why Daniel, in the very last verse of chapter 7, he says, I was sick at heart. I was very, very disturbed by this vision, that God's people would be handed over into the power of an enemy and be allowed to be defeated. Verse 7:21, he will make war with the saints and prevail. He will win and defeat them. Yes, Roger.
Like you were talking about today, in good times and in bad.
Yeah, in good times and in bad. And God's purpose, which we'll see in chapter 9, is God is saying, hey, but these saints are part of my eternal kingdom. And so the reason why we got this vision of the one like a son of man receiving all power and authority is because God is ruling through him, and God's people are going to be sheltered and given the ultimate victory. And so we don't have to worry about this enemy, but the persecution that he brings, the trouble that he brings for the church is very disturbing, because it says he's going to war against us and he's going to even defeat us. And we say, how can that be? I thought God's kingdom was eternal and unshakable and indestructible and all that. Well, it is. And that's the point, is you're not really going to be defeated. You might look defeated. He might kill your body, but he can't hurt your soul, because God is the one in charge of that. Right?
The last thing, but I kept this matter to myself. Is his job at this point still to advise the king and be
yeah, he is still the king's advisor. Yeah, that's right.
But he didn't tell the king about chapter 7.
Yeah, and he still is not quite sure how to understand all of it. And then later on in chapter 12, he's going to be told, the things that you've seen, seal them up. Just keep them quiet for a while, because this relates to the time of the end, and people aren't going to really understand this vision now, but later on they will. That's kind of the idea behind seal up this vision and keep it. That means you want to preserve this vision and you want to pass it on, but people now aren't going to be able to understand quite later on. They'll understand better. And I think we're getting into the times where now this is the time when Daniel's vision is needed for us more than ever, I think. We're getting closer to the end times. I don't know how close we are. That's why I can only say we're closer to the end times, right?
We're always closer to the end times than we were like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. And the more persecuted the Christian church is, the more it looks like the world is winning, the more we're going to need the comfort of Daniel's vision. All right, now, here's how we understand Daniel's vision in chapter 8. So he's going to receive another vision, and this is going to zoom in on part of the vision of chapter 7. But here's the thing, and a lot of Bible scholars have kind of misunderstood this. In chapter 8, it's going to talk about another little horn. And I say another little horn because we say, oh, little horn. That's the same language that's used in chapter 7 for the enemy of God's people. And that's exactly right, the same kind of language. But this is, in chapter 8, we're going to see a little horn that's a type. It is a kind of, sort of a prototype of a bigger little horn that's going to come later on. And so if in chapter 7 we're understanding, and we can even apply this term Antichrist to one who fights against God and against God's people, this one in chapter 8 is kind of a little Antichrist, but he's not the Antichrist, if you know what I mean. So what's actually going to happen is, and here's what's going on, sort of, how do we picture it? Let me put it this way. In chapter 7, you get a heavenly viewpoint, a heavenly perspective, we'll say. All right, so Daniel is seeing into heaven, the very throne room of God in heaven, and saying and learning this is how God is going to deal with the world and even with the enemies. Is first God gives his power and authority and dominion to his ruler, his king that he has established, and he is going to rule God's kingdom. There's an enemy that's coming, but he's going to be destroyed. And so we have this heavenly perspective. Now chapter 8 comes along, and Daniel is going to be more down on the ground, more on the earth, and give sort of a historical viewpoint, we might say, historical perspective. And that is, from down on the ground, it's going to look like what a lot of the prophets before Daniel had this prophetic perspective, and that is, you got the prophet here, and what does he see? He looks at the things that God is doing, and it might look like a mountain range where you have mountains, like the various mountains, and the prophet, from his perspective, he can see this mountain here, and he says, oh, I see something that God is doing in the future. He might not be able to see past this first mountain to realize there's a bigger mountain even behind it, and even a bigger mountain behind that he can't see. He just sees, okay, I see the front of this mountain range, so to speak. So this kind of analogy has been used a lot in explaining, hey, the prophet would say, hey, I see God sending a Messiah, for instance, and I can see that Isaiah says, I can see that this Messiah is going to be a servant who is going to do God's will and to die on behalf of God's people and all this stuff. I can see that this Messiah is going to be a king. I can see that God is going to restore, in fact, restore all creation through this guy. And so the prophet Isaiah says, yes, God is going to send his promised Savior, and it's going to be great. Only he doesn't see that Messiah is going to come, and he is going to go back into heaven, and then there's going to be a second coming of the Messiah. See what I mean? So the prophet Isaiah doesn't realize Messiah is going to come, go back to heaven, and come back again a second time. How could Isaiah know that? All he sees is just the first mountain of the mountain range, right? So this is so for us to understand. Then we see later things that Jesus comes. We could say Jesus comes to you and me, maybe through fellow Christians, and he comes to other people through you and me. And so Jesus can say, even if you gave a drink to somebody else, or fed or clothed them, or visited them in prison, or whatever you've done to the least of these brothers of mine, you've done to me. And we say, oh, well, so Christ's coming is in our daily lives. He's coming to us through our neighbor to say, I have needs. I need you to help me. And so that's Christ, sort of a coming of Christ, right? So that's one, we could say, a coming of Christ in many of our daily activities. But of course, we have Christ's second coming, the ultimate consummation and fulfillment of everything. We call this Judgment Day. And we say, oh, that's the ultimate coming of Christ. So Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, for instance. So we could say his first coming here, and he comes to us in our daily lives, but Jesus is going to come again in an ultimate way. And so this kind of reading of the scriptures, or understanding of the scriptures, this is called typology. To say there's more than one mountain in this mountain range, or there's more than one fulfillment of God's promises. So for instance, when it says, Messiah will suffer, well, is that talking about Jesus dying on the cross for us? Well, yeah, the Messiah is going to suffer. He's going to suffer and die on the cross for us. But Jesus also says, the world is going to hate me and persecute me, and hate you and persecute you because of me. That's going to be part of my sufferings too. And so the Apostle Paul can say, in our lives, we fill up the sufferings of Christ. We complete Christ's sufferings because we're suffering together with him. And so that's part of Christ's suffering too. It's in fact an even bigger part of Christ's suffering than Jesus dying on the cross. It's not, what I mean is, it's not more important than Jesus dying on the cross. That's the important thing, right? But we also participate in Christ's sufferings, and that's part of his suffering too when we suffer, right? And so we see that there's more when the scriptures say that Christ must suffer. It's more than just talking about dying on the cross, isn't it? And in fact, we're going to see Christ must suffer is going to extend all the way to the end, where Jesus and his people, us, his church, are going to have to suffer in countless, numerous ways as the devil attacks us and everything. So, with this kind of concept in mind here, what we're going to see is different kind of mountain range we're talking about here, or different mountains. We're going to talk about the bad guy, the enemy. And it looks like, from the language, it might look like there's only one bad guy when it says there's a little horn. A little horn that represents an enemy of God's people. Well, we're going to see in chapter 8, this is one kind of little horn, but there's a bigger little horn. And I'm going to give that a capital L there. The the little horn is coming, and he is he's called in chapter 9. He is called the coming prince. In chapter 9, he's also called, and so this isn't weird language to us. This is, even Jesus calls him the prince of this world, the devil, right? The devil. But he's also called in chapter 9, he's called the desolator. We have this phrase, the abomination that causes desolation. He's called that. The abomination of desolation, you're familiar with that phrase because in the gospel writers, Jesus, in the gospels, Matthew and Mark, Jesus quotes this. He says, you know how the prophet Daniel talked about the abomination that causes desolation. And those are fancy words, I know it, but it means, another way to translate it is the ravager that cuts people off from life. Because desolation means when you're cut off from life and you got no source of life anymore. That's what it means to be desolate. You got nothing but death. But the desolator is the one who tries to cut people off from life. But then he is also called, even in the same verse in Daniel, then he becomes the desolated one. And I know I'm giving you a preview of chapter 9 because chapter 9 is going to be talking about this little horn. Chapter 8 is going to give us an example of a kind of little horn with a little L and a little H enemy. Okay. So, let's take a look at chapter 8 now. And we'll talk about why we know this is just an earlier part of the vision of chapter 7, and it's not talking about the ultimate bad guy. We'll talk about that as we go. Okay, so let's read. Yeah, I think we're just dedicating today to chapter 8, but I want to get through the whole thing, so we'll have to go through it pretty fast. But let's read through chapter 8 because it's important. So we want to take a look first of all at the first 14 verses. So if we want to, maybe somebody wants to divide it and take half, 1 to 7 or something, and somebody else can pick up 8 to 14. So, Roger?
In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Uli Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew out later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west, to the north, and to the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came towards the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at his height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven.
Okay, and then 9 to 14.
Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and the truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary of the host that will be trampled underfoot. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated.
Okay, so this is a vision, and he sees a ram that's very powerful, but then a goat comes along and defeats the ram. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on trying to understand what this means right now, because in the next section we have the interpretation of the vision. As you can see, the angel Gabriel is going to come, and he's the one who Daniel saw in the previous vision of chapter 7 as well. And notice that in chapter 8 verse 1 it says, I had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. So this is after the vision of chapter 7. All right. And so we know that the vision of chapter 7 is more important, and this one is a sub-vision of it. This is going to show some more details of those beasts that Daniel saw coming out of the sea. And we know what the interpretation is because Gabriel is about to tell us. And so let's look at Gabriel's interpretation here. And we're just going to read 15 to the end of the chapter. I know this is a lot of reading, but how better to understand Daniel than to actually read Daniel, right? So let's take verses 15 to the end of the chapter. So somebody want to take maybe the first half of that?
While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision.
Remember, the Ulai is the canal that he's seeing there.
As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent the four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power.
All right, and then verses 23 to the end.
In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given to you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding.
Okay, so Gabriel explains to Daniel here that this little horn that you see is a power that arises from the Greek kingdom. So we saw before this, the ram was the first thing that Daniel saw by the Ulai Canal. And the ram, Gabriel says, represents the kingdom of Media and Persia. So this is the kingdom of Cyrus the Great, who is on our bulletin cover for today. Okay, that guy his kingdom is the one who is going to defeat the kingdom of Babylon. So if we go back to Nebuchadnezzar's vision that he saw of the statue, and the gold head was Nebuchadnezzar himself representing the empire of Babylon. Well, the Medes and Persians, they came along and basically conquered the Babylonians. So they're the second kingdom, second part of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw. And that was the second beast that came out of the sea that Daniel saw in chapter 7. Then a third beast comes out of the sea. It's the empire of Alexander the Great, the Greeks. Okay, the Greek Empire, which would defeat the Medes and Persians and make their kingdom part of the great Greek Empire, Macedonian Empire. And that would encompass the entire, basically, southern part of what we call Europe now, southern Europe, the Middle East, and northern Africa would be Alexander's kingdom. Huge, I mean, just controlling that entire part of the world there. Gabriel explains now that this goat that Daniel sees, that's Alexander the Great's great empire of Greece. And of course then Alexander is the great horn. Of course, Gabriel doesn't mention him by name, Alexander, but we know from history, now we're looking back. This is all stuff that would happen. Alexander would come along. He would be in the 330s BC. So 330s BC. And that's when he conquers the Medes and the Persians. And so his kingdom, that becomes the third beast that Daniel sees. The third beast of chapter 7. And this is also the goat in chapter 8. So everything makes sense so far? Yeah.
So chapter 7 and chapter 8 is the same, in two different visions of the same story, the same time frame basically.
Yeah.
So they're not like two different events. It's just 8 is rehashing 7 in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. So it's zooming in on some of the beasts that from chapter 7. Chapter 7 doesn't focus on the beasts very much at all. Daniel says he sees these beasts come out of the sea, but what's important is the little horn. And chapter 7 says, we're given this is the heavenly perspective, and you got to see this little horn is spiritually significant because this is the ultimate enemy. There'd be lots of enemies that will arise, lots of various types of little horns that'll arise between Daniel's time and Christ's second coming, the very end of the age, right? Judgment Day. But you have to understand about the main enemy that's coming. But chapter 7, and given the heavenly perspective, says, but first you have to understand, before we even talk about that enemy, that little horn, Antichrist we might call him, you have to understand about Christ, the Messiah, and how he's going to have all the dominion. He's going to rule over everything. He's going to control and dominate everything. And he's going to give his victory to God's people, the saints. So before you talk about any of the enemies that are going to come or the hard times that God's people are going to have, you have to understand you have the victory already. I'm showing you the end first, that you have the victory. Now we got to talk about the difficulties, the troubles that you're going to face along the way. Remember, you'll win in the end, but for now, you got to go through a lot of significant challenges. And one is going to be this type of little horn that's going to arise from the third kingdom, and he's going to be a particular, I should say, enemy with a small e. He's a small e enemy of God and his people, but still significant. so much so that I'm telling you at least over 300 years before it happens, because see, Daniel is seeing all this in the basically the early 500s BC, where this is not going to happen. See, Alexander, let's go through the history that Gabriel does give us. The big horn that the goat has is broken off, and then there are 4 other horns, and those are parts of Alexander when he was killed. I think it was around 330 BC. Then his kingdom was divided up into 4 parts, and each one, of course, was not as powerful as the original Greek Empire. I mean, it's still the Greek Empire, but now the power is divided up, right? Well, then there's another horn that's going to arise from these. Another horn, it says, a little one. A little horn. And we say, oh, well, that sounds like this kind of language from chapter 7. Well, yes, it does. And this is going to be an enemy of God's people, but he's not the little horn that's coming. And we know that because in chapter 7, this little horn that chapter 7 was talking about comes from the 4th kingdom, from the 4th beast. And this, Gabriel is explaining to us, this is the 3rd beast that this little horn comes out of, the 3rd beast. So he's a kind of little horn, but he's not the big one to come. Does that make sense? The big little horn.
Little big horn.
Little big horn.
Couldn't resist.
So the horns are like kingdoms, but represented by their leader. Is the last little big horn is a human person, not a kingdom? But
Right, exactly. Yeah.
have an army also, though.
Yeah, exactly. So, and any kind of horn, a horn is always in the Bible, always equal to a symbol of power. So an animal that has horns is going to be more powerful than an animal that doesn't. And you can use horns, of course, for offense or defense. I think of like a deer or a buck, something like that, you know. That those horns, they can defend themselves and they can attack other creatures. But those horns give them a lot of power, don't they? Okay, so this little horn, so what happens is, what we know from history happened. Yes, Alexander was killed, the empire broken up into 4 parts. Another little horn arose, and the one who proved to be a particular enemy for God's people was one of the guys from these kingdoms, a guy named Antiochus. He was actually the 4th, Antiochus the 4th, but anyway, the city of Antioch was named after him, by the way. Antioch, you can see the name in there. But anyway, which I think is very ironic and interesting, because he's this enemy of God's people, and yet Antioch, remember, in the New Testament became sort of the missionary home base of Paul and his missionary journeys to the west to spread the gospel, right? The gospel went out from Antioch, and that was really the spreading of the Christian church. But this guy that the city is named after is the one who tried to get rid of God's people, exterminate them. This happened, we can read in the books of Maccabees, in the first book of Maccabees. Let's see. This was one of the books written in between the Old and New Testament, and this tells the story, especially of what happened in the 160s BC. Oops. About 165 years before Christ, and this was the Jews wanted to rebel against this Greek empire that was controlling Israel, And especially after this guy arose, Antiochus, he was particularly hostile to the Jewish faith, and he wanted to destroy their temple. He didn't actually destroy the temple, but he profaned it. He set up an idol in the temple and said, I'm repurposing this temple. Now you're going to worship me or worship my gods, whatever it was. But it was this was an abomination to them, which means to the Jews, which means this is something we hate, we detest. This is an idol in our temple, and this is the ultimate sacrilege against God, to set up an idol in his very temple in Jerusalem. All right? And so Antiochus did this. He tried to kill as many Jews as he could. Lots of murdering going on. He was a very hostile enemy to God's people, who just wanted to be faithful to God and worship him in his temple, but they couldn't. He set up this idol there. He corrupted the sanctuary so that people couldn't even go there to worship now. And the Jews were sort of cut off from their faith and not able to go to the temple. And so that would be like if if something happened to our church here, somebody took over, some bad guy came in and said, this is now my temple, and we would say, well, we can't go to Good Shepherd now. It's corrupted. I mean, it's not, we can't worship there like we did before because there's this enemy who's taking it over, right? And we'd say, oh, now we all feel cut off because we can't go to church, so to speak. I mean, ignoring the fact that, well, yeah, there are other churches we could go to, but you know, you kind of get the point. So Antiochus was a particularly nasty enemy to God's people, but that is just a type of the big enemy who's going to come in the end times. This little horn is going to be the ultimate one to sort of try to get rid of Christ, try to oppose God and to oppress God's people. We'll see more about the ultimate enemy in chapter 9. But for now, this is an example of a way, you know, an enemy who did come, who did a similar kind of thing, and yet God's people beware, the worst is yet to come. Okay, does that all kind of make sense?
Is the little horn with the capital letters, is that the 2300 days? Is that when his, say, reign will be? Right, yeah. And so, let's see, there is that in chapter 8 here too. Where do we, it will take 23 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Well, what is this talking about? A lot of people try to figure out the chronology of this. 23 evenings and morning, or 2300 evenings and mornings. Does that mean you take half of 2300, which would be 1150? That would be 1150 days, and they try to figure it all out. In chapter 9, Gabriel is going to give us a little bit more of the chronology, but it's not the exact chronology like years that we wish it was. But what happens is from Daniel's time until the coming of Christ. So let's just make Christ this middle mountain here. Messiah is in Hebrew, Mashiach. Okay, so Gabriel in chapter 9 is going to say, hey, from this time now until Christ the Messiah, we're going to call that 7 sevens. And we say, well, what do you mean by sevens, Gabriel? Do you mean like weeks? Weeks are 7 days? Do you mean 7 weeks? But surely you're not talking about just 7 days or 7 sets of days, 49 days. Maybe he means 49 years or something like that. Or maybe, and people try to figure all this out. Well, the point is, in chapter 9, Gabriel is going to use this word. Oh, sorry, my marker is just giving us double vision here.
sevens, we got to put this in quotation marks because we say, well, that's not a real word, sevens. How can you plural make seven is not a thing, it's just a number, right? But you're talking about it as if it's things or periods of time, and then you make it plural, sevens. And, well, what's a seven as far as a period of time? Well, we know that the number seven is all throughout the Bible, very symbolic number. It represents God's work in the world, His perfect working that He does, and so this is all this is a symbolic language for we're going to divide time periods into sevens, but I'm not going to tell you exactly how many weeks and months and years that is. It's not about calculating the dates. It's not for you to know the dates, right? And so a lot of people have said, oh, well, this little horned enemy comes in that time period, and they're trying to figure out the exact dates of it all. Well, that's a confusing thing about chapter 8 is in verse 14, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Is he talking about? Now we could erase these and have different mountains here. Is he talking about, and this becomes very important in chapter 9 as well, very important for the book of Daniel, but we're talking about here the sanctuary of God, the sanctuary, and when I say sanctuary, what do I mean? What's the sanctuary of God?
Place of worship, is it heaven? Or?
Okay, yeah, place of worship. So heaven is the ultimate, that is the place of worship, but heaven also comes down to earth, and we have earthly places to worship. So what else does God's sanctuary mean? Or could that refer to?
Sanctuary is a place of safety.
Okay, place of safety, that's true. But it in the word sanctuary sanct means holy, a holy place. Okay, so it is a place of safety for us because it's God's heavenly, basically a copy on earth. It's a copy of God's own heavenly throne room where He is worshipped. But on earth, sanctuary can refer to, well, you go back to the time of Moses and the Israelites. For them, it was a tent called a tabernacle, a portable church. And that was their sanctuary until King David came along and he said, God, I want to build you a more permanent structure, a real house on earth, so you don't have to live in a tent anymore. And God said, did I ask for this, David? But okay, that's fine. You want to build me a house? Listen, I will build you a house, David. And this is the more important thing, and this is like, mind-blowing, is that in Daniel, this is what we see going on. Daniel is talking about God saying, David, I'll build you a house. And look at this house I'm going to build, and it's going to be my sanctuary. Got to do my air quotes. Sanctuary on earth, and it's going to be called my church. Now, well, that Daniel doesn't use the word church, but this is what we're going to understand that it's all about. Really, is David says, "I'm going to build you a sanctuary, Lord, a house," and he's talking about building the temple in Jerusalem. And yes, that becomes God's house. And God said, "Okay, David, I will put my name on this place and I will actually dwell here, and this is where people can come and worship me, not only the Jews, not only the Israelites, but eventually all the world is going to come to this place, this sanctuary." And are we talking about just the building, the temple that David built that would be in the place? Here's a picture of the city of Jerusalem. This poster itself could be 50 years old. I don't know when this was printed, but right now you see a big gold dome mosque that the Muslims built on the very site where Solomon's temple used to be. Okay, that was by the way, destroyed by the Babylonians in Daniel's time. And so Daniel sees there's no temple there anymore. In fact, pretty much this whole city has just been destroyed. Like we would see the cities on the Gaza Strip even today, I mean even this month, destroyed, just pretty much leveled. And we'd say, oh, terrible, you know, and now God's people are saying, where do we have to go to worship? Our temple is destroyed, the city of God is destroyed. And God is saying, my city is not destroyed. The house that I am building for David is not destroyed, because you see, I promised David that his own descendant later on would come along and be the king who would rule over my kingdom forever and ever. Right? My plans have not been ruined and destroyed, along with the temple and the city of Jerusalem. Of course, Daniel's concern is, oh, Jerusalem is wiped out, our temple is gone. We are a people who are desolated. We're cut off from God's life, from worship, you know. The enemy won, right? That's kind of what perhaps the Israelites are thinking at this point. The enemy won. And now you're telling me another enemy is going to come along who's going to be even worse than the Babylonians wiping out our city? You know? I mean, you're telling me it's going to get even worse. And you're telling me that when this guy comes along, he's not even going to be the worst, because there's an even bigger... Oh, I erased the little horn. The big little horn is coming. And it's going to get even worse than that. And, oh... this is just like, this is too much for us to try to listen to and endure, God, right? And so it looks pretty grim and depressing at this point for Daniel, for God's people. So again, going back to your question of the 23 evenings and mornings, well, how does the chronology work out? Well, it's a little bit confusing to pretty much, I can tell you, I've read so many Daniel, I read 20 Daniel commentaries, and nobody really quite understands, including me, how to exactly understand the 23 evenings and mornings. And a lot of people try to relate that to, well, is that the same 2,300 evenings and mornings? Let me use a different color here. So, 2,300 evenings and mornings, is that equivalent to in chapter 7 where it says the enemy will dominate for a time, times, and half a time? Could that be the same? Is it like, are we talking about a year and a half or something like that? But you figure it out. Well, if you say this is 1,150 days or something like that, is that a year and a half? No, a year and a half would be, what, about 500, you know, somewhere around 500 days, or, you know, you get the idea, right? A little more than 500 days. No, it's not that. So is it, what's going on here? So it's kind of hard. What does the 23, or is the 23 relating to this time period? 2,300 evenings and mornings. Is that part of until this little horn Antiochus comes along? I think it does relate to that kind of thing, because it's not going, the 2,300 evenings and mornings isn't going all the way up until Jesus is coming. But it's hard, it's difficult.
I kind of took it to mean maybe when that final little horn in the end, the very last one, that's how long he'll have to deceive and destroy. But
yeah.
Once again, how do you know when to start the 2,300 days?
Well, and that's the thing. When do they start? When do they end? Yeah. That's a huge thing. Or is it talking about, it's talking about the sanctuary being restored in 8:14 there. So are we talking about here that the temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, 586 BC? But is it talking about how it's going to be rebuilt? And then after Cyrus allows the people to go back home to Jerusalem and says, I'll even help you pay for it, pay for the temple to be rebuilt and the walls of Jerusalem to be rebuilt. And it happens during, and you can read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah how they do just that. They rebuild the walls of the city and the temple. And is it talking about that? Now the sanctuary is restored. They rebuild the temple, Solomon's temple, and then that's called the second temple, the one that Jesus would have come to and worshipped in, is the rebuilt temple.
So in the long run, it really doesn't matter.
Well, yeah.
The 2300 days don't matter. It's going to be what it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So now, within chapter 8, we're seeing events in history that are being prophesied here. But we also have to understand the big picture of what's God's heavenly plan in all this. Okay. For we're talking not just the city of Jerusalem, but about all of his people for all times up until Jesus comes again the second time, until Judgment Day. Now we're talking about a different time period than just this. Does this represent that time period? Perhaps. Perhaps it represents also the entire time period where the devil is going to be trying to defeat Jesus' work and defeat God's people and try to get us not to believe in God and worship and all that stuff. Okay, so next time we'll get into chapter 9 and we'll see, first of all, Daniel's prayer. And his main petition in this prayer is, restore your sanctuary, O God, that's desolated. Okay, so we'll hear that language again. Restore your desolated sanctuary. That's the prayer. And is he talking about help us rebuild the temple in Jerusalem? Maybe in a sense, yeah. Daniel of course wants the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt and for God's people to be able to go home there and everything like that. But God sends Gabriel again to Daniel to say, I'm going to show you an even bigger restoration of my sanctuary. I'm going to show you not only when the Savior, Jesus the Messiah, comes and how he's going to start to build a bigger city of God and a bigger sanctuary called the New Testament church, but I'm also going to show you everything that happens until the time when, well, first of all, that church grows throughout the entire world, and the enemy is going to try to basically destroy the church, but Jesus is going to come and wipe out the enemy, and that will be the end. Okay, so that gives you a little preview of what we see in chapter 9, and exciting stuff. It's great. So, okay, let's close with prayer. I thank you, God, for blessing us today in your house and time fellowshipping with one another and hearing your word. We thank you for showing us a vision along with Daniel of not only the things that'll come, events of history that for us have happened in the past, but also what you're doing in the future. And that even though we may face difficult times and persecution, even though the devil is at work in the church even now, we know that we have the victory through Christ. And we ask you to help us to remain firm in that victory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you all for coming.